Thank you. Each year at the Ethical Society, we organize our programs around a theme. Our theme this year is Exploring the Human Condition. And we have many fascinating and diverse platforms scheduled for you in the coming months. Our speaker today is the author of Brace for Impact, a memoir, which is about skating with arch rival roller derby, the second best roller derby team in the world, and the way in which the physicality and sport reflected and refracted her dysfunctional childhood. Her next project is a memoir about her immersion into the world of contemporary drag, from an audience member to winning the title of Mix Pride STL. She also creates traditional and visual essays with line drawings and watercolors. Please join me in welcoming Gabe Montesanti.
I want to begin by telling you who I am. I'm a writer and an artist. I'm not a shrink or an expert on art or writing therapy. I have a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction from Washington University in St. Louis. My thesis in the program was a series of essays about my participation in the roller derby team and the ways in which the ruthlessness of that sport echoed my abusive upbringing. My thesis became my book, Brace for Impact, and some of the difficult material within those pages has lost power over me, like a word that, when excessively repeated, ceases to have meaning to the listener. I believe that art can have that power, the ability to become something of a biohazard bag in which to place the things that are too difficult to touch. It's important to acknowledge that in many ways I'm speaking to you from a trauma vortex, both personal and global. My hope is that there's something of use to you in what I have to say. Okay. There's a scene in my book that I've been writing and rewriting in my head since it happened when I was 10 years old. My little sister, who slept in the top bunk above me, was 5 at the time. Our bedroom had been stripped of all the light bulbs by my mother, who frequently used darkness as a punishment. The fish tank we'd been funding with the money we made babysitting and picking up dog poop was the only source of light in the room, and we were content just watching the black mollies and the neon tetras dart around the cheap aquarium plants. But then one started to give birth. We felt shock and then elation. The fish were delightfully tiny, no bigger than our pinky nails. Their gills expanded and tank water flooded into their little bodies. I'd never seen a living creature come into existence before, and I don't know when or if I ever will again. To then watch in horror as the mother fish opened her mouth to consume her young was a kind of devastation for which I was nowhere near prepared. I've ruminated over this event so frequently over the years, I think of a new detail that I'm not even sure is true. Truth is a thing we debate constantly in creative nonfiction. What it is, whose right it is to tell it, and how 2 or more truths can exist at the same time. What I know is that my sister and I stuck our entire arms into the tank and began flinging the little fish away from their mother, but in doing so, we were condemning them to die, gasping on our crusty gray carpet. I know that we were screaming loud enough that my father came in with a little red flashlight clipped to his belt, and he stepped on several of the babies with his big work boots. I know that dozens of fish were born, but we only saved 2. When I was writing this scene for what felt like the 100th time for my book, I worried that readers would feel pounded over the head by the metaphor. Would they see the chaos of being trapped in a small house, a small town, with a mother who tried to both reject and consume me? Would they recognize the importance of the literal and metaphorical darkness, which was a perpetual reality while I was growing up? Would they see that being flung out of the tank, rescued by a well-meaning teacher or doctor who recognized the danger of my mother, would usually just decrease our chances of survival? And what to do with the fact that only 2 fish survived the massacre? me and my sister. It would have been impossible to write or even think about my mother and my childhood without the container of art. How else could I give the impression of what it was like growing up in a house like mine without, as Emily Dickinson says, telling the truth slant? Sometimes the traumas we've undergone require a radioactive container. The poet Gregory Orr uses a similar analogy in his book, Poetry as Survival. He refers to the vessel as akin to the urn, John Keats's Grecian urn in his infamous ode. He explains that writing from trauma often begins with what he calls a rant, developing into the more controlled genre of journaling, with the final stage, in his terms, poetry. Poetry is the most made, most aesthetic, and therefore the most fully outside of the self. The trauma then rests on the urn rather than roiling around inside the body. It gives me comfort not to think of my trauma residing inside myself, like those little fish swimming away from their mother desperately, having nowhere to go. One of the best things I did for myself decades before I even knew the term trauma or the name Gregory Orr was implement a daily creative practice. At 6, I tore through paint by numbers and hot glued parlor beads into little 3-dimensional sculptures. At 8, I filled up composition notebooks with troubling but true stories about my family, where the dot on every I was a heart. At 9, I joined the swim team, and my mother made it clear that she valued my athletic talent over my interest in art, so I kept most of my creative life to myself. At 12, I sold my first painting to my art teacher's mother. At 14, I learned how to knit all sorts of patterns from the reference librarian at the public library, where I shelved books for $7.50 an hour. In high school, I enrolled in an art class every semester, and at 16, I committed to taking and posting a photo on Flickr with a reflection every day for a year. My prepaid track phone didn't have a camera, so I carried around both a digital point and shoot in my school backpack and a very cheap film camera. Then I waited until I saw something that moved me. Oops, it's not advancing. There we go. When I look back now, it's clear I was already implementing strategies future psychiatrists and therapists would teach me in managing my responses to trauma. I was developing a daily practice of noticing what was around me. I was engaging my senses. I was appreciating beauty, even in what some would call the grotesque. I was going on walks by myself and breathing and keeping my head up. I was disassociating less. I was taking note. A daily art practice, or a daily practice of noticing, as I established when I was young, has been my constant companion. It's kept me connected to the world, grounded, even when everything in me wants to take flight. It also gives me comfort knowing that it will be with me forever. In high school, art also kept me connected to the other kids who were deemed screw-ups or rebels, or, like me, had to make art somewhat of a secret. We called ourselves the D-Hallway crew, and although a decent part of our identity was getting high on the adhesive glue that we used in our creations, we were positioned in a back hallway that only we really knew existed. There, we curated a kind of community, though we would never call it that then. All we knew was that we understood each other and the work we were all making. Maybe that's what most artists want, to be understood, to experience empathy. It was something I never felt at home or in any other competitive realm where I always had to fight to win or just to be noticed. Thank you. It didn't take long in my 365 photo project to tire with the idea of beauty. I started taking photographs that were more complicated and conceptual, mostly having to do with the Catholic Church, which would become the topic of my AP studio art concentration when I was a senior. I had no models to execute my visions, so I mostly used myself. Some of my photographs, the early ones, were visual representations of the way I viewed prayer. The local hospital purchased the one I'm displaying now and put it in the cancer ward. They said it would be a comfort. No one was interested in hanging or displaying the rest of my collection. My childhood obsession with original sin came to fruition in many of my photographs as I turned in images of myself, questioning the presence of God, calling myself a hypocrite or evil. I didn't know the word queer yet, not really, but I'd been told my entire life that I was wrong and bad. I liked portraying myself as a monster because most of the time I felt like one. I don't know if you can tell, but it says on the sort of double exposure, "Do you say there is no God?" Sorry. Can you flip it for me? Thank you. In college, I majored in math, a subject in which I barely could tread water, but I was pressured into studying by my parents, and visual art, where I continued to use myself to illustrate emotions I couldn't articulate with words or didn't dare speak. On a whim, I took a poetry class with a writer named Diane Seuss. She is related to Dr. Seuss. You can ask me about it later. She knew several things just upon looking at me, or so she told me. One was that I was raised Catholic. I'd seen it before, she said, withheld Catholic or ex-Catholic students embodying this entrenched goodness or obedience. Your poems weren't obedient, though, she told me, and I made sure all my feedback pushed them even further in the direction of truth-telling. She also knew that I was deeply in the closet with family issues that permeated to my core. At the end of our semester together, Di took me on a ride out to the outskirts of Kalamazoo to the fish hatchery and Wolf Lake, which is the place that inspired her second book of poems, Wolf Lake, White Gown Blown Open. We talked about her 15-year career as a psychotherapist before she started teaching, and my writing, my situation. The abuse I hinted at in my work, which was both so run-of-the-mill and so startlingly specific, didn't scare her and never would. Then she took me out on a dirt road and pulled over next to a field of grazing cows. For several minutes, we sat in silence. I was uncomfortable, not by Di's presence, but by my own. Then she said, "Why didn't you speak up? Why are you shouting?" It was a line Di told me from Marge Piercy's poem, Unlearning to Not Speak. Eyes still locked on the cows, Di said, "That's what you need to learn how to do, unlearn to not speak." Our conversation moved into a discussion about applying to graduate school for writing and about what it would mean to escape from my situation at home. She helped me imagine a future for myself, and when the time came, she extended a hand to pull me toward it. In the 9 months between graduating from college and getting into an MFA program, I tried to keep the content of what would become my future essays on the outside of the urn, as Gregory Orr said, but sometimes it swam around inside me. I coped with bad memories in the ways I knew how or had been conditioned to do. Running for miles on sprained ankles, withholding my food, burning my mother's cruel letters, and then saging off my body in the ash. Di sent me to a psychic named Betty, who told me that in a past life I was strapped to a stake and burned as a witch. Betty gave me mantras, little prayers, to repeat to myself hundreds of times a day, which felt like penance until I mentioned it to Di. "Don't call them prayers," she told me, "call them poems." And that was that. Oops. The work I turned into the 12 graduate school admissions committees across the country was strong, but in retrospect, also very safe. My relationship with my mother permeated the work, even the essays in which she was completely absent. I wrote about how soothing it was to rock on my back in a kayak on a gator-infested bayou in East Texas. I wrote about trying to hide in plain sight in my small town as the fight for federal marriage equality ramped up. I wrote about meeting a man at an art gallery in Rome who I followed back to his rooftop apartment so he could tattoo me with a sewing needle and India ink. "I don't think I have AIDS," he told me as he sterilized the needle, "but we'd better be safe." Washington University in St. Louis was the first MFA program I got into and my top choice. The first thing I did after shooting a barely legible text from work to my girlfriend was call Di. She was used to me calling her crying by this point, although rarely were my tears a consequence of disbelief or relief or joy. With the tuition waiver and MFA stipend, I'd be financially secure, have health insurance, access to a counseling center, the structure of a graduate program, a cohort of 3 other nonfiction writers, and faculty who not only believed in my capacity to create good work, but expected it. One thing that became clear to me in grad school right away was that the word trauma was everywhere in writing circles, describing everything from a hangnail to an atomic bomb, and nowhere in the historical literary canon. It made for a confusing foray into literary nonfiction, although I realized I generally avoided the T word and used terms like struggle or hardship instead. The first essay I turned in for workshop was an illustrated piece about my complicated relationship with my backwoods Grandpa Leroy and painting the roof of his chicken coop every summer. For most of that first semester, I worried that writing about my life in this way was navel-gazing, a word that seemed to me like the ultimate sin in the literary community. My fear of navel-gazing persisted even in writing this presentation, maybe exacerbated by the voices in my head about my own narcissism that have been drilled into me since I was a child. I've run into many people who share this same fear, people who are not necessarily artists or writers, but believe that it is pretentious or vapid to focus on or make art about the self and one's own thoughts or memories. In that first semester, however, I discovered a writer named Melissa Phoebos, whose name I hope you'll remember. I was interested in Phoebos because the first book she had published was about working as a dominatrix while enrolled in graduate school. In a way, I was living my own double life with roller derby and grad school, and I felt an automatic kinship with Phoebos. But the primary reason I found her voice valuable was in how bluntly and shamelessly she identified making art as a survival mechanism. This is what she has to say about navel-gazing in her latest book, Bodywork. What I mean is, tell me about your navel, tell me about your rape, tell me about your mad love affair, how you forgot and then remembered yourself. Tell me about your hands and the things they have done and held and hit and let go. Tell me about your drunk father and your friend who died. Transforming my secrets into art has transformed me. I believe that stories like these have the power to transform the world. We are writing the history that we could not find in any other book. We are telling the stories no one else can tell, and we are giving this proof of our survival to each other. Unlike Phoebos, I was not doing sex work in grad school, but as I mentioned earlier, I was involved with roller derby, a complicated and somewhat underground subculture that would become the subject of my first book. Joining the team here, arch rival, was a full-life immersion. I didn't know how to roller skate. I didn't know a single person on the team. It sounds so stupid when I say it. I didn't even know that the league was among the top 10 best in the world. When I wasn't nestled in the shiny pillars of academia, I was learning to skate and hit in a shitty South City roller rink where stray cats roamed the rafters and the unhoused lived in the empty locker rooms. It felt only natural to start writing about my experiences in derby and turning in these essays for assignments. The people I was meeting were some of the most authentic and strange people I had ever met. And although I was young, I had enough self-awareness at 22 to know that roller derby was a loaded activity for me, given my background. Here's a quote from early in my book. I was putting too much pressure on a sport I barely knew to fill the deficits in my life. My motives weren't pure. I was looking for community, but I also wanted to feel pain. I wanted to hit and be hit. The unpredictability and violence of the sport were magnetic in their appeal, especially the full contact elements. I was eager to cast aside all social conditioning, particularly those unwritten rules that governed what I, as a woman, was and was not allowed to do with my body, and embrace a new set of rules. I thought about the loneliness I had felt in competitive swimming, and that I still felt now, running for miles before the city woke up. But it also had to do with the fact that this was a kind of violence that I could choose and control, and one that would leave evidence on my body. There had been none the day my mother sat me down on my bed when I was 8 and told me with certainty that I would die alone. Coming out to her had caused even more damage, none of which was visible. All I wanted was proof that I could see. I don't know if most people who write books know that they're writing books, but I didn't. In the early stages, I was just fulfilling assignments and working through some massive questions about what it meant to constantly put my body in harm's way. The therapist I saw throughout grad school was also a writer and also had an MFA. We'd sit in her living room with her dog, and I'd read her my essays, and we'd talk about how it was possible for two things to be true at once. For roller derby to be a source of self-flagellation, approaching self-harm, but also a source of joy and confidence. For writing to be both professional and publishable, but also therapeutic in its truth-telling power. French-American artist Louise Bourgeois says, "Art is restoration. The idea is to repair the damages that are inflicted in life, to make something that is fragmented, which is what fear and anxiety do to a person, into something whole." That's what it felt like I was doing in writing about roller derby. One of my professors at WashU thought I was doing something even more important. About halfway through the program, she sent a message to Di to thank her for supporting me throughout the MFA application process and helping me get to WashU. I shouldn't have been privy to this exchange between my mentors, but Di sent me an excerpt, and I was so moved, I wrote it down in my journal. Quote, "I think memoir saves memoirists' lives. Quite literally, since it crafts a permanent record of our lives that can be saved. But it also keeps us from self-combusting. I think with what she's writing now, Gabe is saving her own life." Not long after graduating, a literary agent offered to represent me, and at the beginning of the pandemic, in April 2020, he sold my roller derby project to the Dial Press at Penguin Random House. As I wrapped my head around what it would take to produce a finished product, which my editor warned me would require an entire rewrite, digging even further into difficult childhood memories, I started making what I called micro-memoirs, which were watercolor cartoons about my days. It was a coping strategy. I needed something light, a way to manage the stress of the pandemic and all the unknowns of putting a book about my family into the world. Like most people, my days were simple, so my drawings were too. I drew about my quest to find toilet paper, about my first time trying to make a pot of chili. My drawings were also not concerned at all with being visually pleasing. I drew myself the way I am, fat, hairy, lounging in the bath with my swollen calves resting on the side of the tub. I drew myself binding my breasts and shaving my excessive leg hair. As I reworked the manuscript that would become Brace for Impact, I continued drawing and journaling, which allowed for the relative privacy and authenticity that I needed, entirely separate from the commercial realm. You can just flip through the next couple. These are all images I did. So stay on that one. What I found both in my various modes of self-expression and in reckoning with trauma is that I cycle through states where I am both prolific and fallow. The self-interrogation it takes to write essays and memoir isn't sustainable for me all the time, which is sometimes why I turn to visual art. Now I'm learning how to perform on stage, how to move audiences, how to channel a feeling through myself that I hope will translate to other people. The most important thing, though, at least for me, is that I have an urn, as Gregory Orr described, a container on which to etch the things I cannot carry. Your urn can be so many things, anything you want it to be, any vessel that will help you survive. It can be music or poetry or sidewalk chalk. It can be acrylic nail art or macrame or Dungeons and Dragons. It just has to be something outside of yourself so that anything swimming around, like those little black mollies that I described earlier, don't have a chance to nip at your insides. Upstairs in the loft of my house, where I do most of my writing, I have Marge Piercy's poem, Unlearning to Not Speak, taped next to a clock that needs a new battery and the rusty nail on which holds my first roller derby helmet. I think of sitting next to Di at Wolf Lake, not knowing where to go or who to be or what to say. Whoops. My favorite part of the poem, and the part I want to leave you with, is this. She must learn again to speak, starting with I, starting with we, starting as the infant does with her own true hunger and pleasure and rage. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing yourself. The members of the Welcome Team will now take up a collection to support the Society. If you're moved to make a donation today, we appreciate everything you may be able to offer. Like all nonprofits, we rely on the generosity of our members and friends to ensure our community can keep providing our many free programs. If you don't have cash with you today, you can donate at ethicalstl.org/donate, and those of you on the internet on the live stream can go do that right now. Even better, become a pledging member. If you're interested in joining the Ethical Society, our membership coordinator, Courtney Scott Camerata, will be available afterwards to answer your questions. We'd love to keep you informed about future events at the Society. If you'd like to join our weekly newsletter, use the QR code to sign up. There's also a lot going on. I hope you can find a way to get involved and connected in the community in ways that feel good to you. If you want more details on any of the events, you can check out the weekly newsletter, the Friends of the Ethical Society Facebook, our website, and the calendar, or email the relevant staff person or member. All of our contact information for the various groups and our staff are available on the website. If you hadn't yet attended a listening session to share your priorities with our next leader, there is one more opportunity to do so. And thanks to everyone who came this morning on to the forum. The next feedback session, the last feedback session, is on tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. There's a Zoom session. You can get the Zoom link from the weekly announcement you get in the email, or go to our website in the calendar and it's posted there. Remember to do your holiday shopping at the book cart in the Becker Room at coffee hour. We've added lots of great children's books recently, in addition to books for adults, CDs, and DVDs. Also, look in the hall by the name tags for even more. Everything is $1, and money goes to support the programs of the Ethical Society. You can pay in the drop box at the end of the cart, or give money to Joellen or Kent Forrest. We're always looking for great books that you think others would enjoy. As Amy mentioned earlier, the woman with the antlers, Donna Neist, is still recruiting elf helpers for good cheer. next Sunday evening. Lots of choices of tasks are still dated. Please call her or email her or look for her today wearing those reindeer antlers. The Tuesdays Women Association is holding a bake sale this morning in the Becker Room. All proceeds benefit their social causes. We hope to see you all next Sunday evening for our annual winter gathering, Good Cheer, which will replace the Sunday morning platform. So don't come here tomorrow or next Sunday morning, come in the evening. The Society will also be closed for the following 2 Sundays. We'll meet back here for the regularly scheduled programming on January 7th. Please welcome the Ethical Band to the stage for their final selection, On the Sunny Side of the Street.
Boy, oh boy, this band could do anything, huh? We've done rock and roll, we've done country, and I said, why don't we maybe try some jazz? And they picked out the songs, and I said, okay, we're going out on a limb, and they've been hanging, so please give it up for them one more time.